We're going to show you another 6-minute clip from the movie. This is going to be about broken windows policing crime and how that kind of turned around in New York City, and then we'll have the broader discussion about what can happen here up on stage. I did want to point out one little kind of fun fact about this movie and the interviews, ironically, that you're going to be seeing is that when we started working on it, it was late 2020. And so, of course, every studio in New York was shut down. You couldn't work. You weren't allowed to go anywhere. And I have to thank Mr. Biederman and Larry Moan and Commissioner Bratton because they actually all came to our apartment. So all of the first round of films that we did in our apartment, and they were nice enough to pretend like that wasn't weird and to go with the flow, and we owe them a lot for just like being very flexible. So there's a lot of white walls and random things that you'll see, and that was just our apartment at the time because you couldn't film anywhere else at that moment. So moment of time at that moment. So we will go ahead and get started on this clip, and then afterwards I'll invite Mayor Faulconer and Rafael up to the stage. Thank you, guys.
Giuliani begins a search for police commissioner, and he made it clear that he would be potentially interested in naming me as commissioner based on my success in the subway system, and that I would be his choice for police commissioner effective January of 1994. What Rudy and I both shared was a belief that the city could be made safer, be made better. To take back the streets of New York, in some respects, was like taking Europe back from the Nazis, that it was going to require an all-out assault.
Bill Bratton embarked on this famous experiment in policing called broken windows policing.
George Kelling and James Q. Wilson came up with the theory of broken windows in 1984, saying if you have a window that is broken and it is not fixed, then you will have 2 broken windows, then you'll have 3 broken windows. At some point, you have a neighborhood that is very, very, very hard to recover.
But modern policing did not begin with capturing criminals, it began with maintaining order. And Bratton was very much attuned to this.
Quality of life offenses are as important as serious crime to be addressed. The basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder, the 5 most important words in law enforcement. To deal effectively with crime, you're also going to have to simultaneously deal with disorder.
A healthy neighborhood polices itself in the sense that if you've got a neighborhood with healthy foot traffic, where everyone is employed, where every restaurant and retail space is full, if someone comes along and they break a window, that window will be immediately fixed. It's only when the neighborhood has stopped being healthy that it is not immediately fixed. So once you have gotten to the point where the police are in charge of this, you are already at a point of failure.
We started to focus on stopping and arresting irrigators. What did we find? 1 out of 7 were wanted on warrants for other offenses. 1 out of every 20, 21 were carrying a weapon, box cutters on up to Uzi machine guns. So by going after quality of life, we're also having an impact on crime.
Criminals do not specialize. Criminals are omnivorous. They are multitaskers. They break one law, they break another law. There's a great chain of being in criminality between the low level and the high level. It is all connected. And even if it wasn't, even if Fair Beavers did nothing worse, it still would be essential to stop it because it sends the message that no one is in control.
These guys from Brooklyn that wanted to go to Manhattan and rob, they wouldn't pay the fare, they'd hop the turnstile. And they're bringing the tools of their trade with them, the illegal firearm. You stop, you capture that person, and you're saving a shooting, who knows how many robberies, how many lives are being saved. And we saw that. Those numbers came down dramatically. Violent crime, way down.
In 1994, Jack Maple, who was my Deputy Commissioner for Crime Control Strategies, probably one of the most brilliant people I've ever known when dealing with crime issues, and Louis Anamone, who was Chief of Patrol, effectively created this system of accountability called CompStat, where they required every precinct to have crime maps and to track daily where crime was developing and to do something about it.
So CompStat means computer statistics, and all it is a recounting of each of the 7 major crimes in each of the precincts in the city, on a daily basis so we can get a good picture. How are you doing this week? How are you doing for the past month? And how are you doing year to date?
So CompStat has 4 basic components to it. Timely, accurate intelligence. Gather up your crime information every day. Rapidly respond to those patterns and trends, and precinct captain was expected to know about it, talk about it, and what he was doing about it. Effective tactics, where what you're doing about it, was it working? If not, why not?
10% of the locations in the city accounted for over 60% of the violence in the city. And that became clear early on as we're looking at the maps. Although you might have had 1,900 homicides the year before, there weren't 1,900 different shooters. We had 100,000 robberies. There weren't 100,000 different robbery perpetrators. There were some people doing a lot of the crime. Let's identify them and let's get them.
It was the idea, if you want to prevent crime, you can't wait till there's 30 or 40 incidents to identify, gee, we have a pattern, we have a problem. You needed to do it when it was 2, 3, or 4, to develop a system that you could effectively map out the city, where was crime occurring, and then when you saw those hotspots start to emerge, put cops on the dots. After the first year, the crime declines were so dramatic that the papers and the media reporting dramatic declines in crime. So people were seeing where they got the news, but in the reality in their streets, the prostitutes were gone, the squeegee pest was gone, the disorder was gone, Times Square was starting to get cleaned up. I predicted in a speech at the Manhattan Institute in 1996, after I left as police commissioner, over time, as we corrected behavior, there'd be less need for summonses, arrests, stop, question, and frisk. And I was proven right. The jail population went down dramatically. By the time I left after 29 months, crime was down 39%. I benefited from Giuliani being mayor because I don't think that Dinkins would have ever authorized me to be as assertive with many of the practices that we put into place. And Giuliani did.
And with the decline in crime, New York City began a rebound. More businesses that had been leaving started to stay, and the city started to come back in a way.
All right, great to be here.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Rafael, welcome. We were just talking before we both sat down. We're going to give you a little New York and West Coast San Diego perspective. So it was great to see some of the things that I think we both feel very, very strongly about, and some of the experiences that happened in New York City under the chief. Pleasure to see so many of you and friends. Besides being the mayor of San Diego for 2 terms, my biggest claim to fame is that I'm a visiting professor here at Pepperdine University. And so it's great to see all of you here, and Rafael, all the work that you're doing at the Manhattan Institute.
Thank you.
And the things that we were talking about. And our topic today, of course, is how public safety propels and fuels urban prosperity. Or probably, if you don't have it, what does that mean on the flip side? So why don't we start out a little bit? We'll start with New York. Tell me some of the things that you've been working on, Rafael, and maybe touch on some of probably the big one that we just talked a little bit about. You saw in the clip, the whole broken windows.
Yeah, I mean, so my work at the Manhattan Institute is, the way I see my job is to basically not screw up a really fantastic set of ideas that made New York City better, right? So I see myself as kind of promoting those ideas, refining them. And it's not as hard as it looks, in part because, what happened in New York City was so straightforward for anyone who takes a critical eye to it. And you're able to really assess, how that city was able to turn around. And at the core of it was getting the public safety question right. What I think we have lost sight of as a broader society, but also in New York in particular, is what got us to that point of success. We kind of became victims of our own success in a way. As crime went down, people became less comfortable with the sort of aggressive posture policing that got us there. And so a lot of the work that I do is just reminding people of why aggressive policing is necessary, why paying attention to quality of life is important, why there needs to be a role for robust incarceration if you're going to keep your city safe. And that is a surprisingly busy job, in part because people forget and people don't fully understand a lot of these ideas. I mean, broken windows, I think, is the perfect example of that. It's an incredibly important and revolutionary theory that changed American policing for the better, but it's also something that very few people know how to accurately describe. And George Kelling, who was one of the co-inventors of the theory, along with James Q. Wilson, they posited that theory in a 1982 essay in the Atlantic Monthly back in 1982, but I got the chance to work with him a little bit in the last couple of years of his life, and he was very frustrated by the degree to which a lot of people didn't understand it. And so I think a good place to start is to just say, a little bit about what broken windows the theory was and how it was integrated into policing. And I think the best way to kind of understand broken windows is as a psychological insight. It was a recognition that when human beings are confronted with visible disorder, that sends a signal that they process as a signal for fear. If you walk into a subway station and you are immediately hit with the scent of urine, you are able to process that and you understand that, okay, well, somebody urinated here recently, which means that somebody felt comfortable enough to do that incredibly antisocial thing in this public space. And if someone feels comfortable doing that, and that means they're confident they're going to get away with it, which means that no one's really in charge. And if no one's really in charge, then anything goes. And if anything goes, then I'm vulnerable. And what people tend to do over time is the more that they are confronted with those signals of public disorder is that they avoid those spaces, and then those spaces become increasingly more vulnerable to all kinds of disorder, including serious crime. That's the theory of broken windows. Broken windows policing is the integration of that insight into how law enforcement is done. And one of the best things that New York did was give its police a mandate under Commissioner Bratton to actually go after those quality of life offenses, to go after the people who were urinating in public stations, in train stations, to go after the people who were hopping the turnstiles, to go after the graffiti artists, and not just cleaning that stuff up, but also to interact with the people who were committing these violations, who were engaging in this antisocial behavior. And what was discovered was that this thing that started off just as a service to the quality of life, right? This sort of independently justified endeavor. We want to make New York City cleaner and more pleasant, turned out to have a more significant public safety payoff that was discovered as time went on. In the clip that you all just watched, Commissioner Bratton noted two statistics related to the program of subway turnstile enforcement. One was that 1 in 7 individuals were found to have an open warrant. The other one was that about 1 in 20 or 21 were found to have a weapon. When police began interacting with people for lower level quality of life offenses, what they found was that a good portion of those people were actually found to have been involved in more serious kinds of crime. And so the public safety payoff of that enforcement was actually bigger than what a lot of people anticipated. And that is a sort of insight that I think we have lost sight of. And it's something that I really wish progressives across America, who are in charge of some of the greatest cities that have ever existed, would understand and commit themselves to serving.
It's interesting how and we were just talking a little bit how I'm a big believer in the pendulum always swings both ways. And I think it's coming back to center/common sense. Not only in California, we've got a long way to go, but across the country. And I noted, and it was a couple of months ago, where that pillar of conservative thought, Andrew Cuomo, was talking about, what did he say? He said the dumbest 3 words in public policy ever uttered was defund the police.
That's right.
And I thought, well, that's interesting coming from Mr. Cuomo in New York and all of that. And I vividly remember the first time I heard that phrase, and because I was woken up in my bedroom one night at about midnight, and there was people out in front of my house while I was still in office with a bullhorn yelling, defund the police, defund the police. And I woke up and I talked to my wife, and I said, what are they saying? She says, I think they're yelling, defund the police. And she's like, well, that's the dumbest thing ever. And yet that became, right during that time, we thought, surely, that whole pseudo movement for a while. And in California, I watched as it took hold. And too many of my colleagues up and down the state not only didn't think it was a dumb idea, they actually did it. And they reduced their police budgets. I was the only big city mayor in California at the time that said no thanks. And in fact, I stood up at a press conference with a coalition of folks all around me, and I said, we're going to increase the budget. And we're going to increase the budget by 7%. Why? Because if we want the best and brightest men and women to carry that badge, and if you have an emergency and you call 911, our officers better darn well show up. We need to give them the tools, the training, and the financial support to do their job. And I think you have seen as city after city and now states have looked at that and saw what some of the results were. What did all of these cities in California, when they defunded their police budgets, all of them, every single one of them, 3 years later, they couldn't run fast enough to put money back into their police budget. And so I think that tells you when it comes to leadership and when it comes to policy that will last and what actually it takes to govern a city or a state. And you can't do it by virtue signaling. You actually have to have policies that matter and that people care about, is you have to stand up and be willing to do the right thing, even in the face of what might be a temporary move or a fad. And as we were talking back there, I mean, public safety, I think in both of our opinions, it's the foundation of everything. As mayor, I can't talk about economic development if it's not safe. I can't talk about attracting good businesses or keeping good companies if it's not safe. I can't talk about good quality education in my schools and safety in my parks and playgrounds if it's not safe. And so to see how that really got off track, certainly here in California, and we'll talk about Prop 36 and 47 hopefully in a minute, but to see how some of those, all of the good work that was happening in New York City and how some of that started to get off track, maybe you could, Rafael, comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about New York City and lots of other cities around the country, I mean, Los Angeles, San Francisco, a lot of these places that experimented with, defunding the police, with decriminalizing public order offenses and lower level crimes, the Prop 47 was incredible in terms of, basically allowing people to steal up to $900 worth of goods and not face felony charges. And then people were surprised that, suddenly retail theft became a much bigger problem. But what I think was driving that was two things, right? The public safety dividends of the kind of more aggressive posture that police took paid off in a big way, and it gave people a lot of breathing room in cities across the country. And in the late 90s and early aughts in places like New York, we started to see people take their foot off the gas a little bit, and the sky didn't fall. And they took their foot off the gas a little bit more, and the sky still didn't fall. And that gave people, I think, a false sense of security that they could engage in much larger scale experiments with public safety without, things really hitting the fan in the way that they did. But the other thing is I think a lot of people really latched on to this idea of racial justice. I don't think there's any way around that topic, right? I mean, when you think about the 2020 calls for defunding the police, my guess is that if you asked every single one of the people who were out in front of your house that night, to the last one of them, at least 9 out of 10 would have cited racial justice as the main reason for why they were asking for what they were asking for. And it was an incredibly powerful motivator because nobody wants to be called a racist and nobody wants to stand up in support of institutions that we're all being told at the time are racist institutions that are driving up the numbers of innocent black males being killed unnecessarily, et cetera. And so I just want to stop for a second and just say kudos to you for standing up to that kind of public pressure, because I don't think enough mayors around the country did that, and it really deserves a round of applause, to be honest. But one of the things that a lot of people failed to grapple with was the fact that that experiment and that set of experiments carried a lot of downside risk. And that downside risk wasn't equally distributed across the jurisdictions that they were being done in. The clip that you all just saw, Louis Anemone had talked about at the time when they launched CompStat. They found that about 10% of the locations in the city were responsible for about 60% of the violence. The Manhattan Institute, in the wake of this defund the police era, did a study on crime concentration in New York, and we found that in 2010, 15, and 20, 3.5% of the street segments in New York City accounted for 50% of all the violence. And if you don't know what a street segment is, if you think about a city block, it's corner to corner, both sidewalks, right? So we have about 82,000 street segments in New York City. 3.5% see 60% of all the violence. 1% see a quarter of all the violence. What do the people look like in the neighborhoods where those street segments are concentrated? Right? When you consider the crime decline that occurred in New York City, what you find is that the improvement for life expectancy was concentrated almost exclusively in low-income minority neighborhoods, in the places where you saw the highest concentrations of these street segments. And what I don't think people really appreciated enough, and still don't to this day, is that aggressive policing, sane incarceration policies, what they do is that they concentrate public safety benefits in places where the demographics look exactly like the groups that the individuals calling for these experiments are claiming to represent. And that was something that frustrated me to no end and really motivated me to do a lot of the work that I've been doing as of late. But yeah, I mean, my sense is you would say the same in California, right?
I would, and I like the word you used, experiment, because that's exactly what it was and is, in my opinion. And Prop 47, which passed when I first took office in Marin, I think it was 2014.
That's right. And
I remember coming and doing a press conference saying, well, wait a second, we're going to say you can go steal anything you want in a Target, CVS, or name the store, $950, and it's not going to be a felony. You can do it any day over and over and over again. It's never going to go out and do heroin, methamphetamine, wherever it's going to be. That's not going to be a felony. It's going to be a misdemeanor. And we think that's going to make our cities in California better. That was a failed experiment, right? And Californians came back just last cycle with Prop 36 overwhelmingly and said, thanks, but no thanks. And this is not a partisan issue, right? Democrats, Republicans, and independents all kind of like being safe in their neighborhoods. And one of the things that I always stressed, and on my very first day in office, the first thing I did was appoint a new police chief, because we had some troubles in our department that I wanted to bring in some new leadership, and it was Chief Shelley Zimmerman, who's a big fan of yours, Chief, as you know, and first female chief in the history of San Diego, but who had an attitude of, we're going to be fair, we're going to be open, and yes, we're going to be aggressive in preventing crime. And I said, Chief, you're going to have my full support as mayor. And what she also, I think, was a good, strong advocate of was best practices today are not going to be best practices 5 years from now. And if you go in with that mindset and that mentality, you're going to be able to adjust in what you need to do in terms of policing, in terms of how you interact with your community, how you use technology. We were the first biggest city in California that adopted body-worn cameras. And at the time, a lot of our officers were resistant of this concept, and it completely turned around once they saw the benefits of it in terms of not only for safety from the public, but also officers themselves. And so I think you have to have that ability that says we're going to constantly move forward, but we are not going to lower our standards. We can't afford to do that. And what happens when you do that? In cities or states, we do that, people vote with their feet and they leave. Right? And they leave your city, or that's not going to be something that I want to be a part of. And so I think that's why it's so incumbent. Again, it's not a partisan issue at all. It's a common sense issue. You stand up and say that and be very vocal about it, because it underlies everything we do. Not just urban renewal, but any city in any small town. And failed experiments, you got to call them out for what they are.
That's exactly right. And the body-worn camera issue, I think, is actually really fascinating, not just because of the turnaround in terms of the perception of the intervention on the part of police officers, who I think were largely resistant when these ideas were first being introduced, in part because of the tone and the context in which they were being introduced, right? A lot of people who were, policing reform advocates were pushing body-worn cameras because they thought that it was going to expose police misconduct on some massive level, right? Their mental model was that police were abusing their authority by being too aggressive, and that was causing harm in particular communities that was going to be exposed if we strapped a camera to them and filmed everything that they did. It turned out to be that, of course, as we all know now, body-worn cameras ended up vindicating police officers significantly more often than they subjected them to potential
100%.
criminal penalties. But they also served as a great source of evidence in prosecutions. And so, last I checked, something like 85% of criminal prosecutions in the United States have some video evidence component to them. Body-worn cameras are a big part of that. And so now the very same progressive groups that were calling on police departments to adopt body-worn camera programs are now opposing them and calling them for them to be dismantled, in part because the body-worn camera footage is so often used in criminal prosecutions as evidence against the defendants who are being arrested. And it just gives you a sense of how poorly thought out and reactionary a lot of these policy experiments and proposals were and still are. And I think at the root of that is a certain degree of ignorance about how crime works and how law enforcement works. I touched on one of them already, which was this idea that by policing low-level offenses, that you were taking police out of commission to deal with things that weren't all that serious, right? I mean, a lot of critics of broken windows policing today still say things like, well, police should really be concentrating on the robberies and the rapes and the homicides, and why are they wasting their time? But the reason is because that's how you actually go after and discover the more serious criminal conduct, right? I mean, and this is common sense when you take a minute to think about it. Most criminals do not advertise outwardly their desire to commit a crime in the immediate period before they actually commit that crime, right? Unlike police officers, the robbery crews are not wearing their guns in visible holsters on the side of their hip. The drug dealers generally do not have, tables full of fentanyl with prices saying, drugs for sale here. They hide their criminal conduct. That criminal conduct needs to be discovered. Right, so you need a basis for interaction in order to discover that criminal conduct.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things you talk about is, and I'm glad they showed that in the video, is criminals not going to go out and say, I only do low-level crime. That's all. I'm going to stop. That's all I do. That's my niche. That's just not reality, right?
Nor is it the other way around, right?
Correct. And so it's consequences for actions. I mean, that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And if you don't have consequences for actions, those actions are going to continue. And they're going to get worse. And that's common sense. And again, it's human nature. And so you have to have a fair, just, but aggressive system that says, of law enforcement, that says, this is how things are going to work in my city. And this is what we expect of you. If you don't do that, there are going to be consequences. And cities that do that flourish. You can't have Ryan Park without folks knowing that they're safe. You can't come to the Gaslamp in San Diego if you don't believe it's safe. I mean, you won't have conventions come to your city if they think my convention group can't come around and come outside the hotel and walk in, so you're going to lose all of the hotel revenue and all of the things like that mayors spend a lot of time thinking about. Fundamentally, public safety underlines everything. And so as we look at in Los Angeles and other things, and I'm glad you talked about prosecutors, they go hand in hand, right? I think you're seeing more and more folks across the spectrum saying we need consequences for actions if we want to have safe, secure neighborhoods in a place that all of us want to feel good about living in.
I think that's exactly right. And not only do other private actors like investors and business people see those signals and respond to them by choosing where to invest their money, where to open businesses, where to move with their families. But criminals are also seeing these patterns and responding to them. There was a series of videos that went viral on Twitter recently, or X now, where people were being arrested in Orange County for shoplifting. And they were very, very shocked to be told that they were actually going to be taken to jail. So many of them, you would see the body cam footage and they would ask, okay, well, just give me my ticket. And they said, no, this is Orange County. You don't get a ticket, you go to jail. And the shock, I mean, there's this one particularly great one where these two women are in the back of the police car talking to each other. I thought you said it was only going to be a ticket. It's like, well, no, apparently this is Orange County. They don't play here. The criminal class is aware of the risks that they face. They are responding to incentives, and the progressive prosecutor movement, or the rogue prosecutor movement, or the Soros prosecutor movement, whatever you want to call it, is one of those experiments that I think has really borne that truth out. And again, it's rooted in one of these sort of examples of ignorance about criminality. I mean, the whole progressive prosecutor movement is really characterized by decisions that prosecutors will no longer charge certain classes of offenses, again, because they believe that they're too low level and that resources should be concentrated on the more serious people. But the underlying premise of that is fundamentally wrong. The underlying premise of that kind of idea is that criminals specialize. As you said, there's nobody who says, I'm just a low-level crime criminal. There's nobody who says, well, I only kill people. I don't litter and assault or steal or anything like that. Criminals are generally antisocial. That antisocial disposition manifests itself in a number of ways. So this makes it all the more important for police to interact with people on those lower level offenses, because that's how they're going to get to discover the more serious crimes. One of the statistics I love to tell people from New York, which is that of the about 4,000 to 5,000 gun arrests that the NYPD makes every year, 40% originate as traffic stops. That's almost half, right? There's nothing about a traffic stop that tells you, this person's going to be armed, right? But it turns out that the sort of people who tote illegal firearms also tend not to follow traffic laws very much. The sort of people who jump the turnstile tend to also be the sort of people who are willing to commit other kinds of crimes. And that is one of the lessons that I think was so important in terms of what we learned during the 90s crime decline. But it's also one of the lessons that's being forgotten. And, but I do see signs of that pendulum swinging back, and I think California has given us some really great examples of that. I mean, you already talked about Proposition 36, which rolled back Proposition 47 to some degree, but we've seen some recalls of progressive prosecutors in San Francisco, and the defeat of George Gascon here in LA by Nate Hochman, the recall of Pam Price and Sheng Tao in Oakland. So I'd love to just get your perspective on, what you think the appetite is.
The appetite's voracious for change right now across the political spectrum. Again, and particularly, some of those cities that you just mentioned in San Francisco, where he had a new mayor and others who ran on issues like homelessness, issues like crime, right? Because it affects all of us, and and it's one of the things I wanted to quickly touch on, because I think it's important, is when you allow anybody to kind of do whatever they want out on your streets, that's not compassionate, right? That's not helping anybody. Like, we care about people enough not to let you die on my streets. And part of what we saw under Prop 47 is, with no consequences, drug court basically dried up in California.
New York too?
If you were arrested for, a crime or, heroin, meth, whatever you do on the streets, you would, before you'd get arrested, you'd go to court, and the judge would say, you're either going to go to jail or you can go to drug court and kind of get clean and sober. And most folks would say, yeah, I don't really want to go to jail. That's a nice place. So they would go, and that would be the beginning of getting clean, getting sober, getting your life turned around. That's what we want. We want people to say, we're not just to continue this behavior. That stopped when Prop 47 passed, because there was no consequences, right? I wouldn't have to face jail, and I don't really want to go to drug court, so I'm not going to go. That's why intervention, that word is, I think, an important word. We have to intervene, because if you don't intervene, folks that have mental health issues, substance abuse issues, or both, duly diagnosed, are not going to be in the frame of mind to help make some of those decisions for themselves. And that's why I think a caring, compassionate society that understands there has to be some consequences, and we are going to help, you have to do it. And you can't just hope somebody comes to that decision on their own. Hope is not a strategy.
That's exactly right. And there are real benefits to that, and this kind of goes back to the broken windows idea, because when you walk a street or you drive down a street and you see a homeless encampment, you see people openly using drugs in public, again, that is sending a signal to the passersby that anything goes here, that this particular place is not safe. What does that communicate to anyone who's considering investing in that community? What does that communicate to people who are thinking about moving, who are thinking about sending their kids to school in those kinds of places? I mean, one of the most tragic things, you know, I've seen are these videos of these public parks and playgrounds that have been overtaken and overrun by drug users. And you have plastic slides and jungle gyms, and at the foot of the slide is a pile of used needles. You know, that sends an important signal that makes that particular public space unattractive to the pro-social parts of your community, which are exactly the people that you need to frequent those spaces in numbers so that these things can police themselves. And that, I think, you know, was another just important insight from my colleague Nicole Gelinas in the clip that you all saw. But the hope is that you don't need to have, you know, these kind of you know, jackbooted police officers marching down every street, hitting people with batons every time they break a rule. Yeah. You have to get the community to a particular place that it becomes sort of self-sufficient, where the pro-social outnumber the antisocial, and where the pro-social have the sense of confidence that when somebody does something antisocial in the public space, that they can intervene, and they know that if they do and it goes south, that help is not far behind. And that's the kind of hope that I think gets lost in a city where you engage in these experiments to too high a degree. New York City in the 1970s and 80s was a perfect example of that. What the 90s told us was that there's actually a recipe for turning that around. It just is a matter of political will.
I use my two favorite words, political will.
Yes.
If you have it, you can accomplish a great deal. I don't care if you're in a big city or a small city. If you don't have it, nothing's going to happen. And people can talk, but unless we have elected officials that have the political will to help make the change, you don't see it. That, in my opinion, is the missing ingredient of what we have and why it's so important, I think, for discussions like this and folks out there and in the media and others to help put that accountability on elected officials, to help give them a backbone if they don't have one, which they should have, but maybe they don't, that says, we want you to act. You have to act. And I think that's, you know, unfortunately here in the great state of California, there's been a little too less of that for a while. Pete, let me do a time check. How are we doing on time? Because I know we wanted to have some question and answer. Oh, okay.
Well, yeah.
Well, you tell elected officials keep talking. We're going to talk all day.
Well, you brought up an important point, which is, you know, this sort of political will point, because that is something that I have seen in a lot of cities around the country, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, where a lot of these policy experiments get engaged in because the leadership sees themselves as having a mandate, right? They win the general election, whether it's for mayor or for district attorney, in an overwhelming way. They get, you know, 70, 80% of the vote in the general election. The problem is it's 70 or 80% of a very, very small share of eligible voters actually turning out. And in the primary elections, which is where I think, you know, the rubber really meets the road, you see very little participation. You know, there was in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, who is the Soros DA there, you know, when he won re-election, he said, you know, we clearly have a mandate now. You know, we're going to continue down this path and we're going to engage in this experiment, full-throated support for decarceration and depolicing. And, you know, I have a mandate, I have a mandate, I have a mandate. And you go in and you look at the precincts where he, you know, enjoyed 70, 80, 90% of the vote. It's like 12% of eligible voters actually turned out in those elections. And you see that in Chicago, which is how you get a Mayor Johnson and a Kim Foxx. You see that in Baltimore. You see that in New York City, which is how you get, you know, an Alvin Bragg. And I will criticize him publicly and happily so. So I hope he sees this. But you know, you're someone who had to get elected. How do you overcome that kind of problem?
You know, you have to, you know, you're going to make mistakes, right? I mean, you do as it's on the council, you do as mayor, but you have to be able to take, in my opinion, you have to be able to say, okay, it's worth, you know, if you're not taking a stand, then what are you there for, type of thing. And I think when you phrase things, again, in terms of that all-elusive word of common sense, which I think most people know it when they see it, and say, this is what we're going to be doing in our city. Here's what we're going to expect, and as I said, here's what we're not going to allow. Then I think it helps to bring people along. I will tell you, one of the issues that I think is really facing California, Los Angeles, the issue of homelessness. It's getting worse, not better. And if you don't stand up and say, so what am I going to do about that? And I had to kind of tackle that when I ran for mayor, and then it was an issue when I ran. By the time I left as mayor of San Diego, I spent more time on the issue of homelessness than any other issue I did, because I got tired of the city and the county. Who's in charge of homelessness, right? The county is it the city? I said, look, I'm mayor, these are my streets. I'm going to be held accountable, even if I'm not technically responsible for things like mental health and others. But we're going to act, back to that political will. And we set up the sprung structures. I set up safe parking lots. I set up more shelters, because I actually believe morally it's the right thing to do, that we ought to have a place for people to go. And I spent more dollars in our city budget than we'd ever done that ever. But I also said, if we're going to spend a lot of the taxpayers' dollars on that, you got to use it. I'm not going to allow you to put up a tent in front of your house or in front of your business and think that that's okay. It's not okay. And I didn't allow that. And we changed it. We became the only big city where we actually reduced homelessness by double digits in my last several years as mayor. Then COVID hit, and I had to leave due to term limits. But we had set that trajectory of, again, I'm going to have a place for you to go. I'm not going to allow our public spaces to be taken over by encampments and others. It's a public safety risk, particularly with fires and other things. And so if you have the will that says, this is a problem and we're actually going to do something about it and act, you will bring the public with you. They can disagree over certain elements, but I will tell you what, nobody ever came up to me while I was mayor and said, Mr. Mayor, I wish that tent was back out in front of my business. Or Mr. Mayor, I wish that tent encampment was back on the park and in the canyon there. No, we want to help people. We want to help actually make a difference in our cities and in our counties, but it takes action to do that. And so I was a big believer that if you allow what's going on, you see it particularly in every city right now, that's the number one issue in California, in my opinion. And we need leadership to take action and say it's not acceptable.
All right, shall we do some Q&A?
Q&A time.
Are there microphones going around? Thank you.
Thank you both. This was really helpful. I'm actually a graduate student at Pepperdine, but I'm actually on the mental health side. So I'm currently a clinician as a therapist, and I'm really glad that you both talked about the mental health aspect, because I found like even going to mental health summits and being a part of, going to community events within Los Angeles, within South LA, within Compton, and a lot of what I found is, when I've asked, I want to say predominantly within Compton, mainly because a lot of the population that I work with are in underserved communities. And at least I only know about Compton, they're trying to have more police officers doing foot traffic to sort of have a lot of sex workers be able to ask for help, which I thought was great that they're doing. But, I'm finding with the work that I'm doing that even with doing group therapy and working with other clinical psychologists and them also working with an LAPD to give psychotherapy to the police officers, is that because of the stigma behind mental health, they don't want to go to see a psychologist, right? So there's still a lot of stigma within the mental health. And I guess it goes for a question for either one of you, is do you see maybe in a way where maybe therapeutic services or maybe mental health therapists working alongside LAPD, or NYPD to sort of facilitate that change? Because it sort of seems like there really isn't much happening, because it seems like law enforcement is one way, mental health is another. And maybe what would that look like? If that would that even be possible? I would say, because of the whole defund the police and all these funding issues.
So there are a couple things that I would say. I mean, look, there are some cities around the country that have experimented with things like co-response, right? Co-response is where police officers are responding to, mental health specific calls, along with or aiding mental health workers who are also responding. And that can work to some degree for the lower level calls, right? Not necessarily for people who are seriously mentally ill, who are dealing with deep psychosis, or who are struggling with diseases like paranoid schizophrenia. But I think one of the biggest challenges here is an infrastructural challenge. The reality is that a short period of therapy and intervention may stabilize someone who's seriously mentally ill for a short period of time. But there's a subset of the population that's overrepresented in a lot of these homeless encampments and in the homeless community that are very deeply ill and in need of long-lasting care. And what there aren't enough of are beds where they can go and spend multiple years in a facility that is secure, where they can get the help and medication that they need. Because one of the things that we see in cities across the country is, an individual who is in a mental health crisis will come into contact with police, they'll be taken to a hospital, they'll be stabilized at the hospital, evaluated, released after 24 to 72 hours with a short supply of medication that they are told to go and renew, and then they don't. And they fall right back into the level of psychosis that they were when they were found, and they're back on the street. And I have some personal experience with this. The New York City's answer to my now late aunt's serious mental health problems was to give her a free subsidized city apartment, right? Well, after all, she's homeless. All she needs is a home. Okay, well, she was given a one-bedroom apartment in the Lower East Side of Manhattan in a building that would, cost me $6,000 a month to live in, and she spent maybe 1 to 2 days a month in that apartment. She would be found on the street and in hospitals all throughout New York State, from Lower Manhattan to the Bronx to Poughkeepsie. Who knows where she would be found next? The reality is that a lot of people misunderstand the character of serious mental illness and think that it is something that can be dealt with in a kind of passing way, and it can't. And once you realize that, you start to have to confront the lack of infrastructure for inpatient mental health treatment that is long-lasting. So that's a big challenge. The other big challenge, though, is there's a massive shortage of mental health workers in this country, and it's growing. In 2015, the CDC predicted over the following 10 years a 25% shortfall of mental health professionals to meet the demand. And that's understandable. It's even worse, actually, when you think about the kind of crisis that you're talking about, because a lot of people who are mental health professionals will choose to, and understandably so, to take their degrees and go and open a clinical practice where they're serving high-income communities and charging $200 an hour while they sit in a leather chair in a brownstone and listen to some college kids' problems, right? That's a very fruitful way to manage that career. Not a lot of people want to go, work at an inner city for government-level pay and deal with people who are very deeply in crisis and, physically sick and, all of the, so, that's, I think, another big part of the infrastructural challenge. Do I think that there are opportunities where, police can stand to learn more about, these kinds of things and get trained in how to intervene with people who are in crisis? Sure. But I think we have to manage our expectations in terms of what we expect to come from that.
Yeah, I would, just real quick on that, I would agree with that. We're asking our officers to do so much these days, our men and women out there. Am I a big supporter of having mental health professionals with law enforcement? Absolutely, particularly our homeless outreach teams. I think it's essential. And sometimes folks will say, well, let's just send some of the mental health folks to the lower level calls. You tell me what a lower level call is going to be. You tell me what the nonviolent call is going to be that day, right? That's very tough. But I think when you have that support together, the officers actually will support it. It works. But there's, going back to my earlier point, there's no substitute for consequences for actions and taking care of that. Sir?
So I'm a citizen of Santa Monica. Santa Monica used to have a program for residents and people who work there called the Citizens Police Academy. Each week, 3 hours on Wednesday, they came and the police came and made presentations. That went on for 10 weeks. My question is, what a lot of the people said during those presentations were that they were happy their police went to Orange County instead of LAPD. And somehow, I guess they thought there was a difference. I'm interested, Mayor, if you know that there are differences between police academies, and I'm interested to hear from you whether it would make any difference in the kind of policing that you had other than the the PR that our police are nicer than the LAPD.
I've not heard that, honestly, on the difference in academies. But maybe somebody in law enforcement might be able to speak to that more succinctly or have more knowledge. Because they're pretty all standardized in California in terms of here's what you have to do to go through the academy to be a police officer. And it's pretty rigorous, and we don't want to lower those standards. And I fought very, very hard to not lower those standards. Because we want the best and brightest, right? We want people that are going to do the right thing. And we're going to, in challenging situations, have the aptitude to do that. So I actually spent a lot of time on recruitment and retention while I was mayor. And I said, I want 4 academies a year. I want them full. And if they're not full, Chief, what are we doing to get them full? What do we have to do? What are we paying our officers? What are we doing to recruit officers? And so that pipeline, which I think you're talking about, is obviously pretty darn important. And I think ensuring that you have a strong, robust pipeline is going to help you make the right decisions, that you're going to get good quality men and women, and you don't settle for second. Name me the city that wants to have the men and women that weren't very good at that. And so I've not heard the difference in where the academies were, but my own experience, at least based in San Diego County, and we all, Sheriff's Department worked and others, and San Diego PD ran it. It has to be tough. It has to be rigorous, and you don't want to lower your standards. When you start lowering your standards, that's when your departments get in trouble. And that's when people do the things they probably shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, standards are incredibly important. When you have a post-certification system like you do in California, you're not going to see a ton of difference between the academies. I mean, there's always going to be differences, right? You have different instructors, different personalities. But one of the things that you mentioned, I think I heard you correctly, was that there was a sense that police in Orange County were nicer than LAPD. And yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that how police interact with their communities is largely a function of what they go through. And this is why it's so important to really invest in policing and make sure that departments have the resources that they need. Because when you have police officers who are in a department that's particularly strained for resources, that are consistently under the gun insofar as they're dealing with nonstop backlogs of 911 calls, where the types of calls that they're taking are incredibly taxing emotionally. I've done ride-alongs with police officers who they'll do one traffic stop, and the person will roll down the window and say, "How are you, officer?" And they'll say, "Hey, doing good. Just, you ran a stop sign there, so just hand me your license." They say, "Sure, no problem." It's great. It's a very pleasant interaction. Usually those people, go off on their way without incident. And then you have incidents where the police officers get out of their car, and before they can get out, the driver's out of the car, and he's aggressively walking up to the officer, cursing him out and telling him off, and then he finally gets him back in the car, and he doesn't want to give a license, And officers are dealing with that, and then they're going to a domestic violence call, and then they're going to a car accident scene where they're seeing a corpse, and so there's a lot that they deal with emotionally. And one of the things that I love about the idea of doing these citizen academies is that it can give members of the public a little bit of insight as to what police officers go through. And I think that's something that's sorely lacking in our public conversation. I mean, one of the things that's always been really surprising to me is to watch people talk about use of force situations with complete ignorance as to any kind of hand-to-hand combat. There have been programs where citizens can go into a police academy and actually try to take somebody down who doesn't want to be taken down. And they say, the same people who will be behind a cell phone camera screaming, "Why does it take 5 officers to get this guy on the ground?" Well, they've never had to wrestle a grown man to the ground who doesn't want to be on the ground, who doesn't want to get into handcuffs. And giving those experiences to the public, I think, is actually a really important way to help build that trust and that sense of understanding that I think makes some officers standoffish, understandably so.
There's a couple more questions. Hard to see with the lights. I don't know if they're
Right in front of you.
Yeah, go ahead.
You keep mentioning political will and the experiments and the fact that we know that they're not working. You wouldn't get an argument anywhere in this room.
Probably not in this room, no.
How in the world do we get enough political will to get these things back on track quickly instead of the years and years that it's taking?
Well, I don't think you'll like my answer, which is I don't think that you can. I think in part political will is a function of the reality that people are experiencing. And if you think about the 1990s New York and the 1993 election in which Giuliani won, he won by the skin of his teeth, in part because Staten Island came out and voted in nearly unprecedented numbers. And that was at a time in which New York City was experiencing 2,000 plus murders a year. And even then, it wasn't an overwhelming victory. So my sense is that sometimes political will is a function of how bad things are, which is why I talked earlier about being a victim of your own success when it comes to public safety, and I think we see that a lot. So I don't have a great answer to your question. My sense is that it unfortunately political will changes when people get uncomfortable. It's kind of like the hierarchy of needs. The thing that really inspires people to change course is a certain level of discomfort. And until that level of discomfort comes, people tend to stick with what they're doing.
And challenge candidates, challenge people that are running for office, right? Whether we run for mayor, supervisor, statewide, et cetera, say, what are you going to do on this? That's why it's important for, I think, all of us, not only here today at Pepperdine, but in the media, in the public discourse, to say, here's what we need. Do you agree with that? What are you going to help do with that? And support those women and men that believe, I think that many of us do, on how we ought to be running our cities. Because I do think that there are people out there that will take a stand, that want to take a stand. Some people want to just jump on the bandwagon, right? When it gets convenient, we'll jump on. If you're going to do the right thing, go ahead, right? And now that everybody's decided the defund the police movement was a horrible failure, which it was, great. But let's actually move forward on the things that we need to get busy with. As I said before, you can't virtue signal your way into running the city. You actually have to act and support those folks that are out there doing the right thing. Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Oh.
All right.
Yeah.
Probably don't need a mic. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. Growing up in South LA, my parents took me out of public school, put me in Catholic school, and I'm just setting the table, right? Defunding the police doesn't make any sense. As human beings, we recognize that there are good people and there are evil people, right? And they make that choice. I have a brother and a cousin that are probation and parole, a nephew that 27 years as a deputy sheriff, 3 cousins, state troopers, and a federal marshal. And so I hear both sides. And at the end of the day, defunding doesn't make sense when there's a problem, because the problem's gonna increase. You do a root cause analysis, right? And in any aspect of a problem, and then you attack it based on data and intelligence. And I think that if we put more money into training, we put more money into community-based programming, we put more money into education instead of maybe putting money into areas that don't affect society and are historically ineffective. How about redirecting that money to the areas that are root cause analysis, like a company like Beacon Economics could probably help with that, and identify these areas and put money into it. So, and that's so directed at you, Mr. Faulconer. What do you think about that? And for you, Mr. Mangual, what do you think about investing in enrichment that gives people a different choice so that they can look at life with a different outlook and not look at life as a dead end? Because a lot of people in jail right now probably regret the decisions they make. Sure. But they grow up in a certain community and you're a product of your environment. Not an excuse, just a fact. Sure. Because I know guys that grew up with everything and they made a bad choice and they spent 20 years in prison. Yeah. And I did not understand that. That did not make any sense to me at all. So what do you think about us maybe drawing back from programming that doesn't work, doing a root cause analysis and figuring out what does work and investing in that? And then you have to be accountable. Sure. There's no accountability, there's no change. But maybe, the idea around, it's like my family says, we got 90% of my guys are good, but you have one bad apple and it ruins the perception for us, for everybody. So maybe more stringent hoops that you got to go through to become a police officer to make sure that you're emotionally, you have the emotional equity to do it.
I couldn't agree
What
more
do you
with
think
that.
about that?
I think the standards are incredibly important.
And I'll just, on the resource issue, this is budget time in every city and state right now. Where are we going to spend our resources? Is public safety important? Or the programming is it important? And are you going to back that up with dollars that do that? And so every city is going through all of that right now. Before we had all the different various groups that wanted the same resources all the time across our bargaining groups, and I said, no, we have a real issue in public safety, and we're going to have to address that, because if I don't, I'm going to have problems in other areas. So that, I think, is important right now in real time to show who believes that this is important, and to do that. And I think to your point on the data and how things are working, and again, best practices and new practices, be able to say, I want to jump in with both feet on that, right? And maybe you don't, maybe you're not successful every single time, but boy, let's not be afraid to try, but let's also do it based upon what we know is going to work, and then put some money behind that. Community policing works. Put money behind it. Policing works. Make sure you have enough officers in our police department to do that. Because you can talk about doing a lot of things, but if you don't have the men and women on the street to actually put it into place, then you're just talking about it. Rafael, bring us home.
Yeah, so I mean, what I'll say about, I'm all for pulling money from programs that don't work. I'm all for experimenting with enrichment programs that might work. But one of the most important insights of the 1990s that led to the crime decline was that the whole idea of attacking root causes of crime was unnecessary to achieve the public safety gains that were achieved. This was an idea that was expressly rejected by George Kelling, expressly rejected by James Q. Wilson, expressly rejected by a lot of the criminologists who were behind this movement, John DiLulio, a few other names come to mind. Back then, their assessment was that no, you don't need to address society's problems and fix them in order to achieve public safety. Public safety is a matter of incentives and numbers. Right? I subscribe to a theory of crime called routine activities theory of crime, which posits that you need three things for crime to flourish. You need motivated offenders, they have to come across vulnerable targets, and they have to come across those vulnerable targets in the absence of capable guardians. Most obvious form of capable guardians are police, but could also be other eyes on the street, right? You can affect either part of that formula without ever addressing a societal root cause that is thought to be behind crime. We have so many ideas about what causes crime, and I don't think a lot of people are right about that or even close to the mark. There's this idea that poverty causes crime. Yet if you look at New York City and you look at the crime decline that occurred between 1990 and 2017, right? If you look at 1989 and 2016, which are the years before New York City peaked in terms of homicides and before it hit its valley in terms of homicides, and you look at the poverty rate in New York City, it barely changed. In fact, it moved slightly in the wrong direction over that period of time, in which you saw a nearly 90% decline in homicides. What I think you will find if you do a really deep root cause analysis, because I do agree that people are products of their environment, by and large, is that at the root of crime is an antisocial disposition that drives criminal behavior. What creates those and leads to those antisocial dispositions? My suspicion is that a lot of it has to do with the environment that people are raised in. And the most immediate environment that people are raised in is their home environment. And one of the things that we see in this country is a massive disparity in the distribution of two-parent households. And what do we see in single-parent households over and over and over again? We see that single-parent households predict all sorts of significant changes in life outcomes, and not in the good direction. We see kids from single-parent households are more likely to be conduct disordered in the clinical sense, right? Like a conduct disorders, we have somebody who's familiar with the DSM here, right? All right, so kids who grow up in single-parent households are more likely to be conduct disordered. A subset of kids who are conduct disordered, and that diagnosis can be made as early as age 8. a subset of those kids are going to become life course persistent in that antisocial personality disposition and will develop antisocial personality disorder. If you look at the national population of men in the US, about 2% of men have antisocial personality disorder in this country. If you look at surveys of prison inmates throughout the country, depending on the facility that you are looking at, what you will find is somewhere between 40 and 70% of the inmates in a given facility have a diagnosable case of antisocial personality disorder. And what predicts antisocial personality disorder? Childhood conduct disorders, and what predicts that? By and large, family structure. And that's something that I don't think enough people appreciate. The problem is that that is a root cause that the government is not very well positioned to do much about. And so until we figure out how to fix that very deep social problem, we should take advantage of the things that we know work. Policing, incarceration, prosecution, being measured with those things and being just about how we go about those things and being fair and having competent, emotionally stable, intelligent police officers willing to do that job is an important part of that. But we are never going to get away from the reality that we need those things in place in order to tackle the crime problem and provide for the public safety in any environment.
I would argue that you're right in one half, but on the other hand, as a former youth football coach for 11 years, those kids that grow up in single-parent households, they get their discipline in other ways.
Sure.
And the things that you just spoke of are, in fact, the root cause analysis.
Yep.
And there is a way to deal with it. But, you know, the stick and the carrot aren't the only way.
Yep.
That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. I know we're getting the, we're at
Yeah,
time.
we're getting the,
Rafael, thank you
cool.
all
Thank you.
for allowing us to share some of our thoughts today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mayor, and Rafael, thank you so much. And we're going to take a 10-minute break. Our next panel is going to focus right here in Southern California and the rebuilding effort. Delighted to be joined by State Senator Ben Allen and our new research fellow, Chris Thornburg, as well. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank a couple of our sponsors, Californians Against Retail and Residential Theft. Very excited and appreciative of their sponsorship of this event. They are at carrt.org if you'd like to find out more. Also, we have flyers up in the front. Kevin Harbour, who was our loquacious questioner there at the end, he is with the BizFed Institute, and they've got a great event coming up the end of the month, Build Up LA series, LA Fire Recovery Summit, and that's going to be in downtown LA on April 29th. So those flyers are in the back as well. So we'll break for 10 minutes, and please rejoin.